Angelina Jolie found herself at the center of an unexpected and shocking event at the airport after witnessing a blatant act of racism. What happened next shocked everyone around her. Her powerful reaction and willingness to stand up for justice reveals a new side of her that you won't forget. Don't miss this compelling story that reminds us all of the importance of fighting for equality and justice. The airport has always been a buzzing place, but that day the tension hung in the air from the start. Angelina Jolie, known for her impeccable posture and equanimity, walked through the terminal, surrounded only by the occasional glances of passers-by who tried not to betray their admiration. Her flight was delayed and she, like an ordinary passenger, was passing the time in a cafe at a window overlooking the runway. However, something broke the usual noise of the crowd. Sharp voices followed by a crushing silence. Angelina turned around. At first glance, there was nothing special. An argument was going on at the front desk, but her keen eye immediately noted an oddity. One of the passengers, a short, elderly woman with a basket in her hands, looked confused, as if accused of something she hadn't done. The airport employee spoke to her sharply, almost shouting, and the other passengers seemed to avoid looking in her direction. The crowd gradually began to thicken. People didn't interfere, but the whispers grew louder and louder. "What's wrong? Why is she being yelled at?" came the snippets of phrases. Curiosity and fear were evident on the faces of those around them, but no one took a step forward. Angelina felt a lump of anxiety building in her chest. This was more than just an argument. Her attention was drawn to the words spoken by the employee with obvious irritation. "We can't let you pass. You must leave the building." The woman was explaining something, but her voice was lost in the hum. Angelina's gaze slid over the crowd. There was a tense silence among the passengers. No one wanted to take responsibility. It was at that moment that something clicked. Angelina stood up. Her heart pounded faster, but her feet steadily guided her forward. She didn't know all the details, but her gut told her one thing. This wasn't fair. Her presence here was no accident, and she could feel it now. She stepped closer, but she hadn't given herself away yet. Her famous face was hidden under dark glasses, but an aura of determination was already drawing attention. Something was going to happen. The crowd was growing, but instead of dispelling the injustice, it seemed to be frozen in inaction. Each of the passengers in the check-in area pretended to be doing something important, staring at their phones, rummaging through their bags, or scrutinizing their tickets. But their eyes revealed something that could not be hidden. They saw everything. An elderly woman dressed in modest clothes stood hunched over. Her swarthy skin and accent made her an easy target for those looking for a reason to pick on her. The airport employee, a tall man with a stern expression, kept coming at her with reproaches. "You can't pass. We don't have to explain the rules to you over and over again." His voice sounded like a roll of thunder. She apparently didn't realize what exactly she had done wrong. "I'm just going to my flight." With a tremor in her voice, the woman tried to answer, but her words were drowned out by the employee's harsh phrases. "Your luggage is suspicious, and we don't have time to sort it out," he declared, pointing to her small wicker basket. Its contents, homemade baked goods and small items, probably souvenirs, seemed to him to be cause for accusation. "Are you sure these aren't forbidden items?" The crowd remained motionless. Some were quietly discussing what had happened among themselves, but no one dared to intervene. People's faces ranged from indifferent to those who looked at the woman with disbelief. It was clear that her appearance and background were the reasons why she was at the center of this humiliation. Angelina watched the scene, feeling the anger growing inside her, her hands clenched into fists. She'd seen situations like this before, not on the screen, but in real life, in places where people were judged not for their actions, but for who they were born to be. She stepped closer. The man, standing next to her, whispered to his companion, "I think she's up to something. Why else would there be yelling at her so loudly?" His companion shrugged, quietly replying, "Maybe she really is at fault. Why else waste time on her?" Those words only added to the tension. Why isn't anyone talking? Angelina thought. She looked around the crowd, hoping to see a single face ready to break the silence. But everyone was looking anywhere but at her and the woman. The employee continued, "Either you get out of here or I'm calling security. You clearly don't fit in here." His words cut the ear. It wasn't just an accusation. It was a public humiliation. The woman lowered her eyes. Her shoulders slumped, and she took a step back. It seemed that even she was beginning to believe that her place was beyond this space. But then Angelina took the first step forward. Her voice sounded unexpectedly loud in this sea of silence. "On what basis do you say that?" All heads turned toward her. The crowd grew animated, but the silence became even more oppressive. The employee turned around sharply, his gaze at first expressing annoyance, but then he finally realized who was in front of him. And at that moment, something changed in the air. But is the crowd ready to support her, or will they choose silence again? The airport employee froze when he met Angelina Jolie's gaze. His face instantly lost its sharpness and his voice trembled, but he quickly pulled himself together. It seemed that he was not going to yield even in front of a celebrity. "I'm sorry, madam. This doesn't concern you." His words sounded emphatically cold, as if he was trying to maintain control of the situation. "We're just doing our job." Angelina threw off her glasses, letting everyone see her face. This was not the moment to hide behind anonymity. She stepped closer to the older woman, who was now standing quietly, her head down, as if trying to hide from view. Her hands were shaking, her fingers clinging to the edge of the basket like a lifeline. "She's your passenger. She deserves respect just like everyone else here. And I want to know why you're treating her like this." Angelina's voice was firm, but not raised. She knew there was power in her tone that was enough to make anyone listen. The employee hesitated for a moment, but then pointed to the basket. "This is suspicious luggage. We have the right to question passengers if there is probable cause." Angelina didn't back down. "And your foundation is what? Her looks? Her accent? Or the fact that she doesn't look like you?" The crowd gasped. Jolie's words got to the heart of the problem. The employee blushed, trying to find an excuse. "We're following protocol," he mumbled, but even in his voice there was a note of uncertainty. The woman finally looked up. They were full of tears and fear, but there was a spark of gratitude in them. Her voice was still quiet, but now she dared to speak. "I just wanted to give this to my daughter. It's bread I baked. It's not dangerous, it's just a tradition." Angelina leaned toward her. "It's going to be okay. You're not alone," she said softly before turning to the employee again. But the one, instead of backing down, redoubled his efforts. "Our job is to provide security, and if someone raises suspicion, we have to act." His voice grew louder again and his gestures more aggressive. "She could be anyone. We don't have to explain ourselves." The words sounded like an excuse, but Angelina heard something more in them. It wasn't just compliance. It was the voice of a man used to judging people by their appearance, not their actions. His eyes betrayed a contempt he might not have realized, but it was obvious to everyone around him. The crowd began to whisper louder. Some passengers, inspired by Angelina's intervention, dared to express their outrage. "It's just an old woman," muttered someone in the crowd. "Why so cruel?" added another voice. But the others were still silent. Some turned away, and others, on the contrary, looked with obvious disapproval. It was obvious that there were those in the crowd who agreed with the officer's actions. The situation was heating up. Angelina felt that this could be a decisive moment. If she didn't intervene definitively now, injustice would prevail. Her heart was pounding, but her mind was in perfect order. She knew she had to say something else that would change the course of events. Angelina froze, as if all the surrounding noise had suddenly disappeared. For a moment, the world shrank to two figures: the elderly woman who continued to shake with humiliation, and the employee whose harsh words were flying around the room like sharp shards of glass. Angelina's face expressed a mixture of shock and deep, all-consuming determination. This was the moment when her humanitarian mission and human principles collided with the real injustice before her eyes. She couldn't afford to just watch. Too many times she had seen this sort of thing on her trips to damaged regions of the world. But this wasn't the developing world, nor was it a war conflict zone. This was an ordinary airport in a country that prided itself on its freedom and equality. And that was what made what had happened particularly unbearable. Angelina took a step forward, stepping closer to the older woman, and her voice, though quiet, came through with such force that it instantly caught her attention. "You just said you don't have to explain yourself. But, as a human being, you're obligated to treat others with respect. What did she do to deserve such treatment?" The employee tried to keep his cool, but under the pressure of her words his confidence began to crumble. He pointed to the basket again. "We're following protocol. This is a standard check." "Standard check?" she interjected, raising an eyebrow. There was genuine irony in her voice. "Then why aren't you checking other passengers? Why did you choose her?" The crowd began to whisper quietly. Some finally began to realize that Angelina was asking the questions they had been afraid to ask. The faces of the passengers, previously blank, began to show interest. However, no one dared to speak out loud. Everyone waited to see how far Angelina would go. Her heart was racing, but fear or uncertainty had no power over her. She knew that her words could provoke retaliatory aggression, but she also knew that sometimes silence was the worst form of betrayal. Her gaze fell on the older woman again, and she spoke to her, as gently as a mother speaks to a frightened child. "What's your name?" she asked. "Mariam," the woman replied barely audibly, her voice trembling as if she was afraid that her name itself would be another occasion for judgment. "Mariam, you've done nothing wrong," Angelina said confidently. Her words sounded like a shield, shielding the woman from attack. She turned back to the employee. "If you have specific reasons for suspicion, say them now. But if there are none, I ask you to cease this offensive behavior immediately." The staff member, not expecting such a confident response, faltered. He had to either back down or increase the pressure, but now the crowd began to look at him differently. Every word he said sounded more and more aggressive, and it only disgusted people. "You can't just interfere like that," he finally shouted, hoping to regain control. Angelina stepped closer to him. Her eyes flashed cold steel. "I'm intervening because I see the injustice, and I'm not leaving until you stop." There was no threat in her words, but there was a power that was impossible to resist. It was the moment when everyone realized Angelina Jolie not only talks about fighting injustice, she lives it. The situation was escalating. The employee standing in front of Angelina was clearly feeling the pressure, but he wasn't going to give in. His voice became rougher and his tone even more irritable. "We are acting in the interest of security, ma'am. If you're not satisfied with that, you may contact the complaint service." The crowd froze. People watched, holding their breath, as if waiting to see what would happen next. But Angelina didn't stop. She did what no one expected. Calmly but firmly, she stood in front of Mariam, shielding her from the employee. "If you have a problem with her luggage, check it right now. Before my eyes," she said with such certainty that there was no room for objection in her voice. "But until you prove me right, I'm staying here." The employee froze dumbfounded. No one expected that a world-famous star would so blatantly side with a stranger. A few passengers in the crowd, inspired by her act, began to move closer. "Yeah, she's right," someone muttered. "Why are you attacking this woman?" The crowd began to come alive. Angelina was no longer the only one asking questions. People who had previously been silent began to voice their outrage. "This is wrong," shouted a man from the back rows. A woman with a child added, "She's just a passenger. You have no right to treat her like this." Angelina turned to the crowd. "Every one of us could be in her shoes. Each of us has the right to be here without fear or humiliation," she said, and her words echoed through the hall. She was now being cheered on. The employee, seeing that the situation was getting out of hand, reluctantly called out to his colleague. The second employee, more experienced and clearly embarrassed by his comrade's behavior, approached Mariam and politely asked her to show her the contents of the basket. Angelina continued to stand by her side like a guard. Mariam, trembling, slowly opened her basket. Inside were neatly folded towels and paper-wrapped pieces of bread. Nothing suspicious, nothing dangerous. It was obvious to everyone. The staff member who had earlier loudly accosted the woman turned pale. The crowd gasped. "You spent all this time humiliating her over bread?" shouted one of the passengers. Mariam looked up at Angelina, her eyes full of gratitude, but Angelina knew it wasn't over yet. She turned to the senior staff member. "You can see that there was no cause for suspicion here. I want to know what action will be taken against those who humiliated this man." The crowd supported her with words of approval and nods. This was no longer just a personal drama. It became an example of how one act can change everything. The employee, realizing that further resistance was pointless, apologized to Mariam, but his words were a formality that sounded hollow. Angelina, taking Mariam's hand, said, "You have done nothing wrong. Be proud of yourself." The crowd erupted in applause that echoed through the terminal. Mariam wiped away her tears, but a new hope shone in her eyes. This moment was a reminder to her and to those around her that goodness and justice still have a place in this world. When the noise at the airport began to die down, Mariam stood beside Angelina, trembling not only from the humiliation she had suffered, but also from the inner fear that still pierced her heart. Her words of thanks were stuck somewhere deep inside, but her gaze spoke more than any phrases. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but Angelina was in no hurry to leave. She felt that this story was deeper than a simple incident at the airport. "And where are you flying to?" Angelina asked softly, sitting down next to Mariam so that she was on her level. The question sounded so simple, so casual, that it brought the older woman back to reality. "To my daughter," she answered quietly, her voice still trembling but gradually becoming more confident. "I haven't seen her in 10 years. I wanted to surprise her." Angelina nodded, signaling that she was listening, but there was some pain in Mariam's voice that made Jolie ask more questions. 10 years is a long time. Why so long? Mariam took a deep breath, and her gaze clouded over. "I'm from Syria," she began, and the words instantly caught Angelina's attention. She had been involved in helping refugees for years, and the subject was close to her heart. "We lost everything," Mariam continued, her voice growing quieter. "My home, my family, my husband. He died protecting us, and me and my youngest daughter managed to escape. We made it to a refugee camp, but my oldest daughter, she stayed there. I had to leave her behind to save my youngest. It was the hardest decision of my life." Angelina listened, her heart clenched with pain for this woman. Each of her stories was reminiscent of the stories she had heard on her trips to the refugee camps, but each was a unique tragedy. "I worked for years to save up the money to move her here. I finally succeeded. She's waiting for me, waiting at home to hug me. And Mariam's voice trembled and she couldn't finish. "And you baked her bread to bring with you?" Angelina asked quietly, trying to soften the tense moment. Mariam smiled, but there was more bitterness than joy in that smile. "It's the bread she loved. My husband loved it too. I wanted that smell to remind her of home when she opened the door, of being a family, of having a home." Tears glistened in Angelina's eyes, but she quickly pulled herself together. It was a moment that did not tolerate sympathy without action. She covered Mariam's hand with her own, letting her know that the woman was no longer alone. "You're not just a mother. You're a heroine," Angelina said, her voice sounding confident. "And I'll do anything to make sure you get to your daughter." Mariam looked at her as if she couldn't believe that someone was willing to support her so wholeheartedly. Angelina felt that this case had become something more than a fight against injustice. It was an opportunity to show that even a single act of kindness can change someone's life. At this point, an airline representative approached, apologizing for the incident and offering Mariam a free upgrade to business class. But Angelina didn't stop there. She asked to see if everything was in order with the luggage and personally made sure Mariam wouldn't have any more problems. However, there was already a plan brewing in her head. She knew she could do more. This woman had lost almost everything, but she hadn't lost hope. Angelina was going to make sure that Mariam would not only meet her daughter, but also get a new opportunity to start her life. This tragic story became a personal mission for Jolie, and she realized that her next step would be another example of the importance of actions, not just words. When the situation seemed to be resolved and the airline representative took Mariam away to help her board, Angelina still couldn't leave. A sense of uneasiness plagued her. She looked around the lounge, catching glimpses of the passengers' faces. In this tense moment, something seemed incompletely clear to her. Why had the airport employee chosen Mariam? What had prompted him to take such action? Her intuition said there was more to it than that. She headed toward the front desk where it had all started. There stood the same employee who was now clearly uncomfortable, avoiding her gaze. However, there was another person next to him, a middle-aged man in a strict suit. He was discussing something quietly with the employee, but their tense gestures gave away more than they probably meant to show. Angelina didn't hesitate and stepped closer. She caught part of their conversation. You should have just checked her luggage instead of making this scene," the man in the suit whispered, trying not to attract attention. "She aroused suspicion. I was acting according to protocol." The officer tried to justify himself, but his voice sounded unsure. "And now we're in trouble. Did you see who that was?" The man in the suit cast a glance in the direction of Angelina, who was now standing far enough away to be seen. He instantly changed his expression, trying to look casual. "Angelina Jolie," he said with a strained smile. "What can I do for you?" She didn't answer immediately, letting the resulting silence weigh on both men. "You seemed to mention something about trouble," she finally said, her voice sounding calm but cold. The man in the suit mewed. "It's just a misunderstanding, ma'am. We are sorry for what happened. The employee may have been a little overzealous, but we have no bias." "No prejudice?" Angelina interjected, her gaze becoming piercing. "Then, why did you choose her specifically out of dozens of passengers? She certainly didn't pose a threat." The man tried to dodge again. "We act on the data we receive. Sometimes mistakes happen." Angelina decided to press on. "What kind of data? Are you checking out a person because of a breadbasket? Or was there someone here after all who insisted you pay attention to her specifically?" Those words clearly hurt the man. His gaze wavered, but he still held his ground. Meanwhile, the employee standing next to him began to rub his hands together nervously, as if sensing that he was about to be dragged into the conversation. It was at this point that an unexpected turn occurred. Behind them stood a woman who had apparently heard the entire dialogue. She looked concerned and finally took a step forward. "Excuse me," she said quietly, but loud enough to attract attention. Angelina turned to her. "Yes?" The woman looked confused, as if torn between wanting to remain silent and needing to say something. "Yeah, I saw someone give information to this employee." She nodded toward the nervous receptionist. "It was a hooded man. He was standing in the corner, watching everything." "Are you sure?" Angelina asked, trying to remain calm even though things were boiling up inside. "Yes. He was saying that this woman, she might be connected to something dangerous, but it sounded weird, like he just wanted to point her out. He didn't even have proof." The woman's words sparked a new wave of questions. Who was this man? Why had he chosen Mariam? Was it part of some plan or just an act of senseless cruelty? The man in the suit intervened instantly. "That's irrelevant." Perhaps one of the passengers just panicked. But Angelina didn't believe him. She knew there was more to it than that. Her brain was rapidly running through the possibilities. Had someone pointed out Mariam on purpose, knowing that her appearance and background would arouse suspicion? This wasn't just a random occurrence. It was an attempt to manipulate the system to humiliate an innocent person. "I want to know who this man is," Angelina said firmly, "and I'm not leaving until you figure it out." The man in the suit sighed, realizing that it would be impossible to avoid the investigation. He quietly ordered the employee to review the security footage and tried to assure Angelina that they would do their best. But Angelina already knew. This story was far from over. And her decision to help Mariam now involved more than that, finding out the truth about who was behind it and why they'd chosen her. The surveillance cameras brought unexpected results. Soon, the screen showed an image of a hooded man standing near the front desk. He said something to a staff member who then pointed at Mariam. The man in the video was not doing anything obviously suspicious, but his gestures and insistence on speaking to the employee were expressive enough to make it clear that this was the result he wanted. Angelina stood nearby, watching intently. But instead of anger or aggression, her gaze was focused, even warm. She turned back to the crowd, which had now gathered closer, watching the events unfold. This is what happens when we judge people by their appearance, by their background, by the way they look, she began, her voice sounding confident but not overwhelming. Each of us could have been in Mariam's shoes at that moment. Someone decided they had the right to humiliate her just because she seemed different to them. And we all let it happen. Her words caused many people to lower their eyes. The people standing nearby began to look at each other, their faces a mixture of guilt and embarrassment. Angelina could see that her words were resonating. But that shouldn't be our reality, she continued. We are stronger than our prejudices. Each of us can be a voice for justice instead of standing on the sidelines. We can choose compassion over fear. Mariam, standing nearby, looked up at Angelina. She was still frightened, but now there was gratitude in her gaze. Angelina took her hand gently, as if to let her know that she was here for her and would not let her go through this again. A woman emerged from the crowd with a baby in her arms. "I want to apologize," she said, her voice shaking. "I saw all of this, but I was afraid to intervene. I realize now that I was wrong." Another person joined her, then another. People began to voice their support, apologizing to Mariam for their silence. Angelina's every word seemed to inspire them to action. The staff member who had originally attacked Mariam looked confused. He watched silently as the crowd began to change its attitude and clearly felt outnumbered. His superior, the man in the suit, stepped forward as if trying to regain control. "We'll do an internal investigation," he said, but his voice sounded weaker than he would have liked. "We'll rectify the situation." "You can fix this situation by starting with respect," Angelina replied, her words directed not just to her boss, but to everyone around her. "Not just now, but every day with every person you meet. Our humanity is not shown in what we say, but in what we do." These words caused a new wave of applause. People began to approach Mariam, expressing their support and offering help. The atmosphere, which a few minutes ago had been saturated with tension and mistrust, now changed. It was like magic. One act, one right word unfolded the whole scenario. Mariam, squeezing Angelina's hand, whispered, "Thank you. You have given me hope that good still exists." Angelina smiled at her. "It was you who gave us a lesson, Mariam. You've shown us that being strong isn't always about yelling. Sometimes it's just about standing with dignity." The crowd slowly dispersed, but its mood had changed. It was no longer just an airport where an incident had occurred. It had become a place where fear gave way to kindness and prejudice to understanding. Although it was a difficult day for Mariam, it was also the day of her small victory, the victory of kindness over prejudice. After the incident at the airport, it seemed that things had finally calmed down. Mariam was put on her flight, and the employee whose actions caused the outrage was suspended for the duration of the screening. For Angelina Jolie, however, this was far from the end of the story. She knew this case had deeper implications than just a moral victory in one airport terminal. First step, reaching out to the public. Immediately after Mariam flew away, Angelina contacted her colleagues who worked on refugee rights and anti-discrimination. She realized that what had happened to Mariam was not just an accident. It was part of a system that allowed prejudice to influence people's daily lives. The next day, she released a statement on her social media accounts. Angelina detailed the incident, adding her thoughts on how deep-seated prejudices continue to manifest in today's society. Her post quickly went viral. Hundreds of thousands of people commented, sharing their stories and discussing how similar situations happen everywhere but often go unnoticed. Jolie's statement caused a public outcry. It attracted the attention of international organizations, journalists, and even politicians. People began to ask questions. How many more cases like this remain unreported? How can we change the system so that no one will ever experience such humiliation again? Implications for the airport and employees. The airport, where the incident occurred, was at the center of a scandal. The management was forced not only to investigate, but also to issue an official apology. They admitted that the actions of their employees did not meet standards and promised to introduce mandatory anti-discrimination training. The employee who publicly humiliated Mariam was involved in other similar incidents. Amid pressure from the public and the media, he was fired. But that was not enough for Angelina. She insisted that the system be overhauled not only at this airport, but also at other places where such prejudice could have been damaging. Mariam's story becomes a symbol. Meanwhile, Mariam's story began to take on a new life. Journalists tracked her down and learned more about her fate. When her flight landed, she met her daughter after years of separation. This moment, captured on video by a bystander, went viral around the world. People were moved by her story and admired her resilience. Mariam has become a symbol of fighting injustice and resilience in the face of prejudice. Her story has inspired hundreds of people who have faced discrimination to speak out about their own experiences. Angelina's moving on. For Angelina, that wasn't enough. She decided that her role in this story should not end simply at the level of a statement on social media. She contacted human rights organizations and offered to fund a program to support migrants and refugees facing discrimination. The program included legal aid, psychological support, and educational campaigns aimed at breaking stereotypes. The goal was simple: to ensure that stories like Mariam's never happen again. A wave of change. Angelina's actions sparked a wave of change. Airports around the world began to revise their internal policies to eliminate bias against passengers. The public debate sparked by her post caused many people to start thinking about their own behavior and stereotypes. However, this was only the tip of the iceberg. Angelina realized that change takes time. She continued to use her platform to speak out about these issues, inspiring others to take action. Invisible chains of kindness. What surprised Angelina the most was how her act inspired others. She started receiving emails and messages from people all over the world sharing their stories. Some said that her actions made them intervene in unjust situations, while others said they finally found the strength to forgive those who had humiliated them. A story that began with a single incident at the airport was a powerful reminder that even the simplest acts of kindness and courage can set off a chain of change that will touch the lives of thousands of people. And while Angelina knew there was more work to be done, she felt that this case was proof that the world can be made a better place if each of us takes a step toward justice. A story that began with the humiliation of an elderly woman at an airport became something much bigger than it first appeared. Once the incident became publicized, it spread far beyond the confines of a single terminal. But Angelina knew that the impact of the event would be short-lived unless it was backed up with concrete action and a clear message that would make the world think. For days after the incident, she worked tirelessly. Her phone was ringing off the hook. Journalists, human rights organizations, airport representatives, politicians, everyone wanted to know her opinion, to get a comment, to understand what to do next. But Angelina was in no hurry to give out interviews. She was preparing for something more. A week after the incident, she organized a press conference that was broadcast around the world. There was no glitz and glamour on stage. Angelina stood in a simple white blouse. Her face was serious but calm. She began to speak, and her voice, filled with power and emotion, captured the attention of millions. "I want to tell you a story," she began. "A story about a woman who lost everything but kept hope alive. The story of how her attempt to give her daughter a piece of home collided with injustice and prejudice." She described what had happened at the airport, how Mariam had been humiliated because of the way she looked, where she was from, and what she was carrying. Angelina was not accusatory, but her words were denunciatory. She talked about the systemic problems that allow people to judge others based on appearance, accent, or skin color. "This case is no exception," she said, her voice trembling but immediately becoming even firmer. "It's a daily reality for millions of people around the world. Every day, someone like Mariam faces injustice just because they seem different." Her words were imbued with personal pain. She spoke about what she had seen in the refugee camps, how prejudice destroys lives, how fear of the unknown drives people to cruelty. She looked directly into the camera, not to the journalists, but to everyone who was listening to her at that moment. "We can't change the past, but we can change how we react to such incidents. We can start with ourselves, by looking at the person next to us not with suspicion, but with understanding." Afterward, she revealed that she was launching a global campaign called Seeing Human. The goal of the campaign was simple: to change perceptions. Educational programs in schools, trainings for airport and company employees, highlighting the stories of those who faced discrimination to break stereotypes. But the most powerful moment of her speech was a personal appeal to everyone. "I ask you, don't be silent. If you see injustice, speak up. If you see pain, help. If you see fear, be the ones who bring hope. Each of us has the power to change the world, starting with a small step." Her words echoed. Social networks were filled with stories of people sharing their personal encounters with discrimination. The hashtag #CHuman became a global trend. People around the world began to discuss how the world could be made more just. Mariam's story became the symbol of the campaign. The video of her reunion with her daughter went viral on millions of screens, touching people's hearts. Angelina personally kept in touch with Mariam, helping her get settled in her new country. She shared how Mariam started a new life, but also became an inspiration to others, showing that even the simplest of people can be symbols of strength and resilience. This story was more than an incident at the airport. It was a reminder of how fragile our values are if we don't protect them. It showed that even in the darkest moments, there is room for kindness and courage. The world didn't change in an instant, but something in it began to shift. People began to think more about how their words and actions affected others. Organizations began to change their policies, and Angelina kept at it, reminding everyone, to be human is to see human. Several months have passed since the airport incident. The Seeing Human campaign continued to gain momentum. Schools and universities began implementing educational programs developed with Angelina and her team. Corporations implemented anti-bias training, and airports around the world implemented new rules to protect passengers from discrimination. Mariam, whose story was the catalyst for this change, was now living with her daughter. She began working in the local refugee community, helping others adapt to life in a new country. One day, she received a letter. The envelope bore the official UN stamp. Inside was an invitation to a special event where she was to be honored for her resilience and contribution to the fight for equality. The event, held in Geneva, brought together world leaders, activists, and journalists. When Mariam took the stage, the room erupted in applause. She stood there, excited and touched to the core. "I never thought my life would mean anything to anyone," she began, her voice trembling. "But I realized each of us can be that person who changes the world. Even if you don't know how to fight, just stay kind. Kindness is a force that cannot be broken." Angelina, sitting in the front row, looked at Mariam with pride. This was the moment when her efforts became tangible. She saw how one woman's story had inspired an entire room, and then the world. After the event, Angelina and Mariam spent several hours together discussing how else to continue the work. Angelina knew that the real reward is not a statuette or a certificate, but a change that touches people's lives. A year after the airport incident, the Seeing Human campaign reached a new level. It was supported by dozens of countries, international organizations, and celebrities. Angelina was on the road, traveling to conferences, refugee camps, and educational institutions to speak about the true power of human compassion. At one such event in New York, a documentary video based on Mariam's story was presented. The movie showed her journey from her destroyed home in Syria to meeting her daughter at the airport. It was not just a story about her life, but a call to everyone to see each person as a person, not a stereotype. The show ended with prolonged applause. Many viewers could not hold back their tears. After the movie, Mariam herself took the stage. Her words became the culmination of the evening. "I didn't want to be a symbol. I just wanted to live. But I'm proud that my story helped open someone's eyes. We are all the same, even if we are taught to see only the differences." Her speech made global news headlines. The See Human campaign was no longer just inspiring. It was now changing laws and policies. Grants to support migrants, educational scholarships, and anti-discrimination initiatives were created. Angelina, standing backstage, watched it all. She knew that the work wasn't over yet, but she also knew that one act, one story, one right word could start a chain reaction of change. On the way back to the hotel that night, Angelina thought about how the incident at the airport had changed not only her life, but the lives of so many people. She realized that real change begins with those who are not afraid to say, "This is wrong." And if there are more people like that, the world really can be a better place. She woke up the next morning thinking, "Today is a new day for kindness. What are we going to do with it?" Angelina and Mariam's story ended not on television screens or newspaper pages, but in the hearts of millions of people who found inspiration in their actions. What began as a random incident at the airport has become a movement that has come to symbolize humanity, compassion, and the power of standing up to prejudice. 2 years after the incident at the airport, Angelina and Mariam met again at a small event organized in the local refugee community. It was an informal meeting, far from loud cameras and noisy applause. Mariam was now working as a coordinator of support programs for new families, helping people start new lives. She was a confident, strong woman, admired by all who knew her. "You changed my life," Mariam said, holding Angelina's hand tightly. "But most importantly, you made me realize that each of us can be a light in the darkness." Angelina smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. "In fact, it was you who changed my life, Mariam. You showed me how much more needs to be done, and how even a small spark of kindness can rekindle the flame of change. Meanwhile, the Seeing Human campaign continued to grow. Its support spread to new areas: health, justice, education. People in all corners of the world began to incorporate the values it promoted into their lives and work. It wasn't just a movement, it was a legacy. In parting, Mariam gave Angelina a small gift, a basket of homemade bread, which she now baked not only for her daughter, but also for neighbors and friends. This bread became a symbol of her journey from loss to recovery, from pain to hope. Angelina carried this basket with her, feeling that it carried more than just bread. It was a reminder of the importance of seeing people for what they are, helping those in need, and not being afraid to fight for justice. Although the world remained imperfect, it became a little kinder thanks to one moment at the airport when someone dared to stand up for a human being. Mariam and Angelina's story proved that change starts with us, and that sometimes all it takes to start them is one voice saying, "This is wrong. We can do better." That voice was everywhere now, and its echo promised not to be silenced. If you made it to the end of this story, we want to say thank you so much. Your time, your emotions, and your attention to such important topics are invaluable to us. You are part of our community that believes in goodness, justice, and change. We really want to know what you think. Write in the comments what touched you the most, or share your thoughts on how you would act in such a situation. Perhaps you have your own stories to tell. We read your every word and value each and every one of you. If you would like to continue to be with us, discuss such important topics, and make a difference together, please subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us create even more inspiring stories that remind us that humanity and goodness can conquer all odds. Thank you for being with us.